The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Commander Sarah Chun walked through the main gate. Her crisp, white uniform bore the insignia of her rank, but, to the group of junior officers lounging near the entrance, she looked like just another woman trying to play sailor. "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" called out Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a cocky pilot who had graduated from the academy 6 months ago. His friends snickered behind him. "The base tour doesn't start until 10. Sarah stopped walking and turned toward the group. She had dealt with this type of welcome before, though it never got easier. At 34, she had spent 16 years in the Navy, working her way up through every possible challenge and obstacle that military life could throw at her. "I'm not here for a tour," she replied calmly, adjusting the folder under her arm. Morrison stepped closer, his chest puffed out with false confidence. "Then, maybe you should head back to wherever you came from. This is a military installation, not a place for civilians to wander around." The other officers laughed louder now. Ensign David Park, barely 22 and fresh from his first deployment, shook his head in disbelief. "Can you believe some people just walk onto a naval base like they own the place?" Sarah looked at each of them carefully. She recognized the type immediately: young, overconfident, and completely unaware of who they were dealing with. These were the same kinds of officers who had questioned her authority at every step of her career, from her days as a young ensign to her current position. "You know what?" Morrison continued, emboldened by his audience. "I think you need to prove you belong here. Remove your uniform. Let's see what kind of credentials you're really hiding under there." The group erupted in laughter. Several other personnel walking nearby stopped to watch the scene unfold. Sarah noticed a few senior enlisted personnel exchanging worried glances, but none of them stepped forward to intervene. Sarah's expression remained completely neutral. She had learned long ago that losing her temper would only give these types of officers ammunition to use against her later. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. "Before I do anything," she said quietly, "I think you should know something about the person you just gave that order to." Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "Save the sob story, lady. Either prove you belong here or get lost." Sarah opened the wallet and held it up for the group to see. The morning sun caught the gold insignia inside, making it gleam brightly. The laughter died immediately as the officers realized what they were looking at. The eagle insignia of a full admiral stared back at them from Sarah's identification card. Morrison's face went from cocky confidence to pale shock in the space of a heartbeat. His mouth fell open as he stared at the ID, then at Sarah's uniform. Finally, noticing the subtle differences in her insignia that marked her as a flag officer. "You just told an admiral to remove her uniform," Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of authority that made several of the junior officers take an involuntary step backward. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Other personnel who had stopped to watch began to realize what was happening. Word started to spread quickly through the gathering crowd that the woman these junior officers had been harassing was actually one of the highest-ranking personnel on the entire base. Ensign Park looked like he was about to be sick. Lieutenant Morrison opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. The confident swagger that had carried him through the confrontation had completely evaporated. Sarah closed the wallet and slipped it back into her pocket. She looked at each officer in turn, memorizing their faces and name tags. She had not gotten to her current position by letting disrespect slide, especially not when it was this blatant and public. "I believe you have something you want to say to me," she said, waiting for their response. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, we didn't know, we thought." "You thought what exactly?" Sarah asked. "That because I'm a woman, I couldn't possibly be a senior officer? That my uniform was somehow a costume? That you had the authority to make demands of personnel whose rank you didn't even bother to verify?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, because that was exactly what they were. Sarah had spent her entire career fighting against assumptions like the ones these officers had just demonstrated. She had worked twice as hard as her male colleagues, proven herself in combat situations they had never faced, and earned every single promotion through merit and dedication. And still, on a regular basis, she encountered officers who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see: not what was actually standing in front of them. The crowd around them had grown larger. Senior enlisted personnel were now watching with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to anger. Several other officers, both male and female, had stopped their morning routines to witness the confrontation. Sarah noticed Captain Williams approaching from the direction of the main administrative building. He had obviously heard about what was happening and was coming to assess the situation. Williams had served under Sarah's command 2 years ago and knew exactly how capable and professional she was. "Admiral Chun," Williams called out as he got closer. "Is everything all right here?" The group of junior officers looked even more uncomfortable as they realized that other senior personnel were now involved in their very public mistake. Sarah nodded to Williams. "Just having a discussion with these officers about proper military protocol and respect for the chain of command." Williams looked at Morrison and the others, his expression making it clear that he understood exactly what had happened. "I see. And how is that discussion going?" "We were just getting to the part where these officers explain their behavior," Sarah replied. Morrison finally managed to speak in something approaching a normal voice. "Admiral, ma'am, we sincerely apologize. We made a terrible mistake. We didn't recognize your rank, and we acted completely inappropriately." "That's a start," Sarah said. "But I'm more interested in understanding why you thought it was acceptable to make the demands you made of anyone, regardless of their rank. Do you regularly tell personnel to remove their uniforms as some kind of test?" The question highlighted the real problem. Even if Sarah had been a civilian contractor or a junior enlisted person, the officer's behavior would have been completely unacceptable. Their mistake wasn't just failing to recognize her rank. It was the entire attitude and approach they had taken. Morrison looked at his feet. "No, ma'am. We were out of line." "Yes, you were." Sarah looked at the assembled group of junior officers. "All of you were." She turned to Captain Williams. "I believe these officers could benefit from some additional training on military courtesy and proper conduct. Perhaps you could arrange something with their commanding officers?" Williams nodded. "Absolutely, Admiral. I'll make sure this is addressed immediately." Sarah looked back at the junior officers one more time. "You'll be hearing from your chain of command about this incident. I suggest you use this as an opportunity to reflect on your behavior and attitudes." Without another word, she turned and continued walking toward the administrative building, leaving the group of officers standing in stunned silence behind her. As she walked away, Sarah could hear the murmur of conversations starting up among the crowd that had gathered. Word of what had just happened would spread throughout the base within hours. Some of that attention would be unwelcome, but perhaps it would also serve as a reminder to other personnel about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or what assumptions they might make. Admiral Sarah Chun walked into her temporary office at Naval Base San Diego, the incident from the morning still fresh in her mind. She had been assigned here for a special inspection tour, evaluating the readiness and morale of various units across the Pacific Fleet. What she had experienced at the front gate was unfortunately not uncommon, but it still frustrated her every time it happened. Captain Williams knocked on her door frame 20 minutes later. "Admiral, do you have a moment?" "Come in, Williams. What's the status on those officers from this morning?" Williams closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her desk. "I've spoken with their commanding officers. Lieutenant Morrison is under Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez in the aviation wing. The others are spread across different departments, but they're all relatively junior personnel." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "What's their service record like?" "Mixed bag," Williams replied, consulting his notes. "Morrison actually has decent flight scores, and his previous evaluations have been solid. But there have been some complaints about his attitude toward female personnel. Nothing that resulted in formal action, but enough to create a pattern." This was exactly what Sarah had suspected. Officers like Morrison often flew under the radar because their technical skills were adequate, and their behavior wasn't quite severe enough to trigger major disciplinary action. But that didn't mean the behavior wasn't having an impact on unit cohesion and morale. And the others? Ensign Park is new, only been here 3 months. His record is clean, but his supervising officers report that he tends to follow the lead of more senior personnel rather than thinking for himself. The rest are similar, competent enough at their jobs, but susceptible to group mentality. Sarah nodded. She had seen this dynamic many times before. One or two officers with problematic attitudes could influence an entire group of junior personnel, especially if there wasn't strong leadership to counter it. Have any of them filed complaints or requested transfers? She asked. Williams shook his head. No formal requests. But I did some discreet asking around. And there are definitely female personnel who avoid certain areas and duty assignments when possible. They're not reporting it officially, but they're adapting their behavior to avoid conflicts. This was one of the most frustrating aspects of the problem for Sarah. When military personnel felt they had to change their behavior to avoid harassment or disrespect, it meant the military was failing in its duty to provide a professional working environment for everyone. I want to review the complaint procedures for this base, Sarah said. And I want to talk to some of the female personnel, both officer and enlisted, to get a better understanding of what's happening here. Williams made notes as she spoke. I can arrange meetings with personnel from different departments. Should I tell them what this is about? Not specifically. Just let them know I'm conducting routine morale assessments as part of my inspection tour. I want honest feedback, and people are more likely to be candid if they don't feel like they're being asked to report on their colleagues. There was a knock on the door, and Williams opened it to find Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez standing in the hallway. She was a compact woman in her early 30s with the bearing of someone who had earned her position through hard work and competence. Admiral Chun, I apologize for interrupting. I wanted to speak with you about Lieutenant Morrison, if possible. Sarah gestured for her to come in. Please, have a seat. Captain Williams was just briefing me on the situation. Rodriguez sat down and looked directly at Sarah. Ma'am, I need to be honest with you. This morning's incident was inexcusable, but it wasn't completely surprising. I've been trying to address Morrison's attitude issues for months, but I haven't been getting the support I need from higher up the chain. What kind of support do you need? Morrison is a talented pilot, and his technical skills are excellent. When I've tried to write him up for his behavior toward female personnel, I've been told that as long as his flight performance is satisfactory, personality issues are secondary. I've been encouraged to handle it through counseling and mentorship rather than formal discipline. Sarah felt a familiar frustration building. This was a classic example of how good technical performance was often used to excuse problematic behavior, especially when that behavior primarily affected women or minorities. Tell me about the specific incidents you've tried to address. Rodriguez opened a folder she had brought with her. 3 months ago, he made comments to a female mechanic about how women weren't strong enough to handle certain equipment. When she reported it, he claimed he was just being helpful and offering to assist her. 6 weeks ago, he questioned the competence of a female supply officer in front of several junior enlisted personnel, suggesting that she had gotten her position through quotas rather than merit. Sarah listened carefully as Rodriguez continued describing a pattern of behavior that was clearly designed to undermine female personnel while staying just below the threshold for serious disciplinary action. And your chain of command's response. Morrison's previous commanding officer told me that these were personality conflicts and that I needed to work on my communication skills to better manage difficult personnel. When I escalated to the squadron commander, I was told that Morrison was too valuable as a pilot to risk losing over interpersonal issues. Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This type of response was exactly why problems like this persisted and grew worse over time. Sarah looked at both officers. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, I want you to document every conversation you've had with your chain of command about Morrison's behavior. Include dates, witnesses, and the exact language that was used in their responses. Captain Williams, I want you to review the personnel files for everyone involved in Morrison's chain of command. Yes, ma'am, they both replied. I also want to understand how widespread this problem is, Sarah continued. Rodriguez, in your opinion, is Morrison's attitude typical of the officers in your squadron, or is he an outlier? Rodriguez considered the question carefully. He's one of the more vocal ones, but he's not alone. There are several officers who share similar views, and there are others who don't necessarily agree but don't speak up when they witness inappropriate behavior. The overall culture tolerates it, even if individual commanders say they don't support it. This was exactly what Sarah had expected to hear. Cultural problems in military units were rarely caused by individual bad actors. They were usually the result of systemic failures in leadership and accountability. What about the enlisted personnel? How do they respond to this kind of behavior from officers? It depends, Rodriguez said. Some of the senior enlisted personnel are excellent mentors and advocates for all their people. But there are others who seem to think that dealing with discrimination and harassment is just part of the job, especially for women. They tell female personnel to toughen up or prove themselves rather than addressing the underlying issues. Sarah made notes as Rodriguez spoke. She was building a clear picture of a unit where problematic attitudes were allowed to flourish because they weren't being consistently challenged by leadership at any level. Admiral, Williams interjected, there's something else you should know. Word about this morning's incident is spreading throughout the base, but the reactions are mixed. Some personnel are embarrassed about how you were treated. Others are saying that Morrison and his group were set up or that you should have identified yourself immediately. This didn't surprise Sarah at all. Whenever incidents like this became public, there was always a portion of personnel who found ways to blame the victim rather than examining their own attitudes and behaviors. Let them talk, Sarah said. Sometimes these conversations are necessary for people to understand why certain behaviors are unacceptable. The important thing is that we use this as an opportunity to address the underlying issues, not just punish the individuals involved. Rodriguez nodded. Ma'am, what should I tell Morrison and the others about their status while this is being investigated? They're to report to their regular duties as scheduled, but I want them to understand that their behavior is under review. They should also be informed that any retaliation against personnel who cooperate with this investigation will result in immediate disciplinary action. Sarah looked at both officers. I want daily reports on the morale and behavior in your units. If this morning's incident was just the tip of the iceberg, I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. 3 days after the incident at the main gate, Admiral Sarah Chun sat in a conference room interviewing female personnel from across the base. What she was learning painted a disturbing picture of systematic issues that went far beyond the behavior of a few junior officers. Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos, a communications specialist with 8 years of service, sat across from her with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She had requested to speak with the Admiral privately after hearing about the ongoing morale assessment. Ma'am, I need to tell you about something that happened last month, Santos began. But I'm worried about what might happen to my career if I make waves. Sarah leaned forward, her expression encouraging but serious. Petty Officer Santos, I can promise you that reporting inappropriate behavior will not negatively impact your career. In fact, it's your duty to report violations of military standards and values. Santos took a deep breath. There's a group of officers who have what they call evaluation sessions for female personnel. They claim they're trying to help us improve our performance, but really they're just looking for reasons to criticize us and undermine our confidence. This was news to Sarah, and it sounded like a systematic pattern of harassment that went well beyond individual incidents. Tell me more about these evaluation sessions. Who organizes them? And how often do they happen? Lieutenant Morrison is usually involved, along with Lieutenant Foster from the engineering department and Lieutenant Commander Nash from logistics. They'll call female personnel into informal meetings and go through our performance records, looking for any mistakes or areas where they can claim we're not meeting standards. Sarah made detailed notes as Santos continued. What makes these sessions different from normal performance counseling? They don't follow proper procedures, and they're not documented in our official records. They also focus almost exclusively on female personnel, and the feedback is always negative, even when our official evaluations are positive. It's like they're trying to convince us that we don't belong here. This was exactly the type of behavior that Sarah had suspected was happening based on her conversation with Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez. It was sophisticated harassment disguised as legitimate military mentoring. Have any of the female personnel reported these sessions? Santos shook her head. Most of us are afraid to. Morrison and the others are skilled at making it sound like they're trying to help us. They say things like, we just want to make sure you're ready for the challenges ahead, or we're concerned about your ability to handle pressure. It's hard to report that kind of language without sounding like you're being oversensitive. Sarah understood exactly what Santos was describing. She had encountered similar tactics throughout her own career, behavior that was clearly intended to intimidate and undermine, but carefully crafted to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't experiencing it directly. I want you to document everything you remember about these sessions, Sarah said. Dates, locations, who was present, what was said. Even small details might be important. Yes, ma'am. There's something else, though. Some of the female officers have started avoiding certain assignments and opportunities because they know these evaluations will follow. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kim turned down a chance to attend advanced training because she was afraid Morrison and his group would use her absence as evidence that she wasn't committed to her duties. This information made Sarah's frustration turn to anger. When harassment created a situation where qualified personnel were limiting their own career opportunities to avoid mistreatment, it wasn't just affecting individuals, it was damaging the military's ability to develop and retain talent. There was a knock on the conference room door, and Captain Williams entered with another officer that Sarah didn't recognize. Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Jackson from the Inspector General's office. He drove down from Naval Base Coronado to assist with the investigation. Sarah stood to shake hands with Jackson, a tall African-American officer with the methodical bearing of someone experienced in conducting sensitive investigations. Admiral Chun, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from Captain Williams. Based on what I'm seeing, this appears to be a pattern of behavior that may require formal investigation under the military justice system. Sarah nodded. Lieutenant Commander, I'd like you to interview Petty Officer Santos here. She has information about organized harassment activities that I think you'll find very relevant. Jackson sat down and opened his notebook. Petty Officer Santos, I understand you have information about informal evaluation sessions. Can you start from the beginning and tell me everything you remember? As Santos repeated her story to Jackson, Sarah stepped into the hallway with Williams to discuss the broader implications of what they were discovering. How many other personnel have come forward? Sarah asked. 6 more have requested interviews, and I expect that number to grow once word spreads that people are being taken seriously. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez has also provided documentation of her attempts to address these issues through her chain of command. Sarah looked through the window into the conference room, where Jackson was taking detailed notes as Santos spoke. What about the commanding officers who failed to take action when Rodriguez reported problems? Williams consulted his notes. Squadron Commander Dale has been here for 2 years. His response to Rodriguez's concerns was consistent with his general management style. He tends to avoid confrontational situations and prefers to handle problems through informal counseling rather than official action. And his superior? Captain Morrison, no relation to Lieutenant Morrison, has been focused primarily on operational readiness and mission completion. Personnel issues are generally delegated to subordinate commanders unless they affect operational capability. Sarah shook her head. This was a classic example of how leadership failures at multiple levels could create an environment where inappropriate behavior was allowed to flourish. I want both of them interviewed as part of this investigation. If they failed to take appropriate action when problems were reported, they need to be held accountable. Williams nodded. Jackson has already scheduled interviews with them for tomorrow. Sarah looked back into the conference room. What about the personnel who witnessed the harassment but didn't report it? I understand the difficulty of speaking up, but we need to understand why our systems for reporting and addressing these problems aren't working. That's going to be a challenge, Williams admitted. A lot of people are afraid that getting involved will make them targets. Others genuinely didn't understand that what they were witnessing was inappropriate behavior. This was one of the most frustrating aspects of addressing military harassment for Sarah. The same chain of command and unit cohesion that made military organizations effective could also make it difficult for people to speak up about problems. We need to make it clear that witnessing inappropriate behavior and failing to report it is itself a violation of military values, Sarah said. People have a duty to maintain professional standards, not just for themselves, but for their fellow service members. Jackson emerged from the conference room with Santos, who looked relieved to have finally shared her experiences with someone in authority. Admiral, Jackson said, based on what I've heard so far, I recommend that we expand this investigation to include a comprehensive review of the command climate across this entire installation. The problems appear to be more widespread and systematic than initially indicated. Sarah agreed completely. Do it. I want every aspect of how personnel issues are handled at this base examined. If we're going to fix this problem, we need to understand exactly how extensive it is. Santos approached Sarah before leaving. Ma'am, I want to thank you for taking this seriously. A lot of us had given up hope that anyone would listen to our concerns. Petty Officer Santos, it's my job to ensure that every service member can do their duty in a professional environment. You did the right thing by coming forward. After Santos left, Sarah turned to Jackson and Williams. How long do you estimate this investigation will take? If we do it thoroughly, probably 6 to 8 weeks, Jackson replied. But I can provide preliminary findings and recommendations within 2 weeks if you need faster action. Do both, Sarah said. I want preliminary findings quickly so we can address immediate problems, but I also want a comprehensive investigation that will prevent this from happening again. As the two officers prepared to leave, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction that problems were finally being addressed properly, but frustration that it had taken an incident like the one at the main gate to bring these issues to light. She suspected that similar problems existed at other installations throughout the Navy, and she was already thinking about how to use what they learned here to improve policies and procedures across the entire service. 2 weeks after the investigation began, Admiral Sarah Chun received the preliminary findings from Lieutenant Commander Jackson. What she read in the report was both worse than she had expected and completely consistent with the patterns she had observed throughout her career. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic harassment affecting over 20 female personnel across multiple departments. The informal evaluation sessions described by Petty Officer Santos were just one part of a broader pattern of behavior designed to undermine women's confidence and limit their career advancement. Sarah called a meeting with the installation's senior leadership, including Captain Morrison, Squadron Commander Dale, and several other commanding officers who had failed to address reported problems. The conference room was tense as she laid out the findings. Gentlemen, the investigation has revealed serious failures in leadership and accountability at this installation, Sarah began, her voice carrying the full authority of her rank. These failures have created an environment where harassment and discrimination were allowed to flourish. Captain Morrison, a career officer in his late 40s, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Admiral, we had no idea the situation was this extensive. If personnel had reported these problems through proper channels. Sarah interrupted him with a look that could have frozen seawater. Captain Morrison, personnel did report these problems through proper channels. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez filed multiple complaints about Lieutenant Morrison's behavior. Several enlisted personnel made informal complaints to their supervisors. The problem wasn't a lack of reporting, it was a lack of appropriate response. She opened the investigation file and read directly from Jackson's findings. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez reported inappropriate behavior 6 times over the past year. In each case, her concerns were dismissed as personality conflicts or communication problems. No formal investigation was conducted, no documentation was created, and no corrective action was taken. Squadron Commander Dale looked pale as Sarah continued. Commander Dale, when Rodriguez escalated her concerns to you, you advised her to work on her own communication skills and suggested that she was being oversensitive. You also told her that Lieutenant Morrison was too valuable to risk losing over interpersonal issues. Dale started to respond, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. I'm not finished. The investigation also found that several other female personnel attempted to report harassment and inappropriate behavior to their supervisors, only to be told that such treatment was normal and that they needed to prove themselves by enduring it. The room was completely silent as Sarah laid out the systematic failures that had allowed the problem to persist and grow worse over time. The most damaging finding, Sarah continued, is that this installation's leadership created a culture where technical competence was considered sufficient to excuse inappropriate behavior. Multiple officers were protected from accountability because they were considered valuable assets, regardless of how they treated their fellow service members. Captain Morrison finally found his voice. Admiral, we certainly never intended to create that kind of environment. We were trying to maintain mission readiness while dealing with personnel issues. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. Captain, Intent is irrelevant when the impact is this clear and this extensive. Your job as a leader is to ensure that all personnel can perform their duties in a professional environment. You failed in that responsibility. She turned to address the entire group. Effective immediately, there will be significant changes in how this installation operates. First, all personnel involved in the harassment will face appropriate disciplinary action, up to and including court-martial proceedings for the most serious violations. Sarah could see several of the commanders exchanging worried glances as they realized the scope of the consequences they were facing. Second, every commanding officer who failed to properly address reported harassment will be relieved of command pending a formal review of their fitness for leadership positions. This includes anyone who dismissed complaints, failed to document reported problems, or prioritized operational concerns over the welfare of their personnel. Commander Dale looked like he was about to be sick. Admiral, surely there must be some consideration for officers who were trying to handle these situations in what they thought was the best way. Commander Dale, there is no best way to handle harassment other than to stop it immediately and hold the perpetrators accountable, Sarah replied. Your failure to understand that basic principle disqualifies you from leadership responsibility. Sarah stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base. The investigation also found that several female personnel have requested transfers or are considering leaving the military entirely because of the treatment they've received here. That represents a significant loss of talent and experience that this service cannot afford. She turned back to face the group. But the most troubling finding is that many personnel, both male and female, have lost faith in the military's commitment to its own values. They no longer believe that merit and performance are what matter most, because they've seen inappropriate behavior rewarded and good people driven away. The weight of this statement settled over the room. Every officer present understood that when service members lost faith in the fairness and professionalism of their organization, it undermined everything the military stood for. Admiral, Captain Morrison said quietly, what do you need from us to fix this situation? Sarah returned to her seat and opened another folder. Captain Morrison, you'll be relieved of command this afternoon. Your replacement will be Captain Jennifer Walsh from Naval Base Point Loma. She has extensive experience in organizational reform and cultural change. Morrison nodded, accepting his fate. He had known from the moment Sarah entered the room that his career was effectively over. Commander Dale, you'll also be relieved and will report to Naval Personnel Command for reassignment evaluation. Lieutenant Morrison and the other officers directly involved in harassment will face court-martial proceedings. Sarah looked at the remaining commanders. For those of you who remain in positions of authority, understand that you're being given an opportunity to prove that you can lead effectively. But that opportunity comes with absolute zero tolerance for failure to address personnel problems. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez entered the room at Sarah's invitation. She had been waiting outside while Sarah delivered the preliminary consequences to the senior leadership. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez will be taking command of the aviation squadron, effective immediately. She has demonstrated the moral courage and professional competence that this installation needs in its leadership. Rodriguez took a seat at the table, and Sarah could see the mixture of vindication and determination in her eyes. She had been fighting these problems for months, and now she finally had the authority to implement real solutions. Rodriguez, what do you need to restore professional standards in your squadron? Rodriguez consulted notes she had prepared. Admiral, first I need to conduct one-on-one counseling sessions with every person in the squadron to assess the current situation and make it clear that inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated going forward. Sarah nodded approvingly. What else? I want to implement mandatory training on professional conduct and military values, but I want it to be practical and specific rather than generic sensitivity training. People need to understand exactly what behaviors are unacceptable and what the consequences will be. This was exactly the kind of practical approach Sarah had been hoping to hear. And for the female personnel who have been affected by harassment, I want to work with each of them individually to address any career impacts they may have suffered and to ensure they have the opportunities they deserve based on their performance and potential. Sarah felt a sense of optimism for the first time since the investigation began. Rodriguez understood that fixing the problem required more than just punishing the perpetrators. It required actively working to repair the damage that had been done. "You'll have my full support in implementing these changes," Sarah told Rodriguez. "And you'll have the support of the new installation commander as well." As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on how much could change when leaders were held accountable for creating and maintaining professional environments. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but she was confident that it would happen. 6 months later, Admiral Sarah Chun returned to Naval Base San Diego for a follow-up assessment. As her car pulled through the main gate, she noticed several changes immediately. The security personnel were more professional in their interactions, and there was a different energy about the place, more focused and respectful. Captain Jennifer Walsh met her at the entrance to the administrative building. Walsh was a compact woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked hair and the confident bearing of someone who had successfully commanded in challenging situations before. "Admiral Chun, welcome back. I'm excited to show you what we've accomplished here." As they walked through the base, Walsh provided an overview of the changes that had been implemented since Sarah's investigation 6 months earlier. "The most important change has been in accountability," Walsh explained. "We've made it clear at every level that professional conduct is not negotiable, and that technical competence doesn't excuse inappropriate behavior." They stopped at the aviation hangar, where Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was conducting a briefing with her squadron. Sarah could immediately see the difference in the atmosphere. The personnel were engaged and professional, and she noticed several female officers participating actively in the discussion without any signs of the tension or discomfort she had observed during her previous visit. "How did Rodriguez handle the transition to command?" Sarah asked. "Brilliantly," Walsh replied. "She had to make some tough decisions early on, including recommending several officers for transfer when they couldn't adapt to the new standards. But she also worked hard to mentor people who were willing to change their behavior." After Rodriguez finished her briefing, she joined Sarah and Walsh for a tour of the squadron facilities. The change in her demeanor was striking. She carried herself with the confidence of a leader who knew she had full support from her chain of command. "Admiral, I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to lead this squadron," Rodriguez said. "It's been challenging, but we've made real progress." "Tell me about the challenges," Sarah replied. She knew that cultural change was never easy, and she wanted to understand what obstacles Rodriguez had faced. The biggest challenge was dealing with personnel who understood that the rules had changed but weren't happy about it, Rodriguez explained. Some officers tried to comply minimally, while making it clear they thought the new standards were unnecessary. Sarah nodded. This was a common pattern when organizations attempted to change long-standing cultural problems. People would often comply with new policies while continuing to resist the underlying values those policies were meant to enforce. "How did you handle that resistance?" "I made it clear that attitude mattered as much as behavior," Rodriguez said. "It wasn't enough to avoid saying inappropriate things. People had to actively contribute to creating a professional environment for everyone." They walked past a group of junior officers who were working on aircraft maintenance. Sarah noticed that the group included both male and female personnel working together without any apparent tension or hierarchy based on gender. "What about the female personnel who were affected by the previous harassment?" Sarah asked. "How are they doing now?" Rodriguez's expression became more serious. "Most of them are doing well, but it took time to rebuild their confidence and trust. Several of them had internalized the message that they didn't belong here, and it required ongoing mentoring and support to help them realize their full potential." Walsh added, "We also had to address some practical issues. Several female personnel had been avoiding certain assignments or opportunities because of the previous environment. We had to actively encourage them to pursue advancement and make sure they had the support they needed to succeed." They entered the base communications center, where Petty Officer Santos was supervising a team of technicians working on radio equipment. When she saw Admiral Chun, her face lit up with genuine happiness. "Admiral, it's so good to see you again. I wanted you to know how much things have improved here." Sarah was pleased to see Santos looking confident and engaged in her work. "Tell me about your experience over the past 6 months." "It's been like working at a completely different base," Santos replied. "Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez has been an amazing leader, and The new policies have made it clear that everyone's contributions are valued. I actually volunteered for additional training last month because I knew I would be supported rather than criticized. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped to hear. When personnel felt valued and supported, they were more likely to pursue opportunities for growth and advancement, which benefited both the individuals and the organization. Have you noticed changes in how male and female personnel interact? Sarah asked. Absolutely. It took a while for some people to adjust, but now it feels like we're all just sailors working together rather than having to constantly prove that we belong here. As they continued their tour, Walsh briefed Sarah on the broader changes that had been implemented across the installation. We've restructured our complaint and reporting procedures to make them more accessible and effective, Walsh explained. We've also implemented regular climate assessments to identify problems before they become serious. What about training and professional development? We've overhauled our leadership training to focus heavily on creating inclusive environments and managing diverse teams. We've also implemented mentoring programs that pair junior personnel with senior leaders who are committed to their development. Sarah was impressed by the comprehensive approach Walsh had taken. Real cultural change required systematic changes across multiple areas, not just new policies or training programs. They ended their tour in the same conference room where Sarah had delivered the consequences to the previous leadership 6 months earlier. Walsh had arranged for several personnel to brief Sarah on specific improvements they had observed. Chief Petty Officer Williams, a senior enlisted leader with over 15 years of service, spoke first. Admiral, I've been at 5 different installations during my career, and I've never seen a transformation like what's happened here. The change in morale and professionalism has been remarkable. Lieutenant Junior Grade Park, who had been one of the officers involved in the original incident at the main gate, also addressed the group. Admiral, I want to apologize again for my behavior that morning. But I also want you to know that the training and mentoring I've received since then has made me a better officer and a better person. Sarah was pleased to see that Park appeared to have genuinely learned from his mistakes rather than simply complying with new rules to avoid punishment. Lieutenant Park, what was the most important thing you learned from this experience? Park considered the question carefully. I learned that respect isn't something you withhold until people prove they deserve it. Everyone deserves to be treated with professional courtesy regardless of their rank, gender, or any other characteristic. After the briefings concluded, Sarah met privately with Walsh to discuss the broader implications of what had been accomplished at the base. Captain Walsh, the transformation here has been remarkable, but I'm wondering about sustainability. How do you ensure that these improvements continue when personnel rotate to new assignments? Walsh had obviously thought about this challenge extensively. We've documented everything we've done so that it can be replicated at other installations. We've also made sure that our personnel understand they're ambassadors for these values when they transfer to new assignments. Sarah nodded approvingly. What about resistance from other installations or higher headquarters? There's been some skepticism about whether maintaining high standards for professional conduct might impact operational readiness, Walsh admitted. But our performance metrics have actually improved since we implemented these changes. When people feel valued and respected, they perform better. This was consistent with research Sarah had seen on organizational effectiveness. Units with inclusive, professional cultures typically outperformed those with problematic climates, even when the latter had technically skilled personnel. I'm going to recommend that the approach you've developed here be implemented fleet-wide, Sarah told Walsh. The Navy needs leaders who understand that professional conduct and operational effectiveness aren't competing priorities, they're complementary. As Sarah prepared to leave the base, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning 6 months ago, when a group of junior officers had made the mistake of judging her based on their assumptions rather than her actual qualifications. The transformation at Naval Base San Diego proved that real change was possible when leaders were committed to creating professional environments where everyone could succeed based on their merit and contributions. More importantly, it demonstrated that holding people accountable for inappropriate behavior didn't weaken military effectiveness. It strengthened it by ensuring that the best qualified personnel could rise to positions of leadership regardless of their background or characteristics. As her car drove away from the base, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the successful resolution of a particular problem. She had helped create a model that could be used to address similar challenges throughout the military, ensuring that future generations of service members would have the professional environment they deserved.